Hello everybody and welcome to the ISO 2400.org event on embodied carbon. I'm Shaun McCarthy. I'm a Director of Action Sustainability, which has two businesses, Action Sustainability Trading Limited and Action Sustainability Community Interest Company, which is a not-for-profit organisation. Our mission is to build the body of knowledge around sustainable procurement, and that's really what we're doing today. We sponsor and host the ISO 2400.org website, which I'm sure many of you have already visited. There's a vast array of different resources there for you to learn about sustainable procurement from contributions from people around the world. And we host sessions like this, where we invite expert speakers from around the world to talk on specific subjects. We invite questions from you on the chat, and we start to engage in a conversation around subjects that are of interest to people. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce the subject matter to talk about where we're going, and then introduce the speakers. I'll ask them to introduce themselves one by one to talk about their subjects. Please do feel free to enter into the chat function and to start to get involved and ask questions. We can mediate those questions as we go through today's session. So I'm going to hand over to James now to make a start.
Thanks, Shaun. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everybody. Yes, we're going to start off today's discussions by a quick survey. It's all anonymous, so don't worry about getting the wrong answer. It's all anonymous. So if we share that screen now so people can see the question. So there you go. What you should see on your screen, and I see a lot of you have punched in the answer already. Excellent. Does your organisation have a carbon reduction strategy? Yes, no, don't know. So most of you have got a carbon reduction strategy in some shape or form. That's really good to see. Has your organisation set a commitment to be net zero carbon by 2050 and or a science-based target? So you've got four choices here. Yes, in development, no, and don't know.
James, this is Josh. One quick thing while people fill out their poll. My question would be, how do we define what net zero carbon is?
Great question. I think we'll get onto that in a little bit. Okay, so we've got 13 out of 17 there are saying, yes, we've got one or it's in development. So that's really promising. That's really good. So who's got most influence in this space in terms of that kind of net zero agenda, working down, reducing our carbon in whatever shape or form it comes? Is it the government? Is it clients, contractors, suppliers, investors, or NGOs? Okay, so we're seeing a majority here for client, and then second place is government. That's kind of not surprising, but it definitely sends a message that if the client has got that kind of control or influence, then we should be actively managing them as well as them managing us. So we should be expressing our desires to reduce carbon and demonstrating to them how we can help them achieve that, as well as them just kind of saying and dictating what they need as well. And clearly government has got a role here about driving minimum standards, supporting through financial incentives and so on. Excellent. Interesting that contractors and suppliers got very little or nothing in this. We can come on to that as part of our discussions later. Okay. Who would you like to collaborate with more on climate change and associated impacts? So suppliers are coming out strongly, government's coming out strongly, manufacturers as well. Public, definitely, yeah, the wider public getting in their engagement and understanding. Policymakers, yeah, policymakers which crosses government, but also within private organizations, other institutions. Excellent, okay, and government, definitely there. Clean energy industry, okay, that's an interesting one. And procurement teams, yeah, well, definitely. Procurement teams are at the hub of all of this. I think that's really good. We've got some clear messages here. Suppliers and government have got a lot of role to play. So this one is a question about your organization and how much investment there is into lower carbon alternatives. So we're talking about embodied carbon today, but it could be about carbon reduction in any sense, whether you think there's any kind of proactive investment or R&D into lower carbon options, lower carbon alternatives. What I'm seeing from this so far is that many people aren't aware of what's going on, and there could well be some good stuff going on, but it's not maybe communicated or developed enough that the rest of the organization is aware of this, that it's maybe not enshrined in policy that people can visibly see. It's not given the airtime it's needed from leadership. So there's a clear message there for me that messaging needs to be stronger about what an organization is doing, irrespective of how much is actually being invested. It's the awareness of what is being done. Excellent. So thank you very much, everybody. That was really useful. It gives the speakers a bit more grist to the mill to go at in terms of awareness of carbon innovation and investment, but also where the picture lies in terms of, have we got carbon reduction strategies? Have we got routes to market that we can engage with? So thank you for your engagement on that. The technology works, and it's really good at getting some user and some audience interaction. I just wanted to continue on the conversation for a few minutes before we hand over to our other speakers, just to set a bit of context. Some of you may or may not know that in the UK, we recently put forward an amendment to our Climate Change Act law, our bill that makes it a legal requirement for the UK to be net zero by 2050. Definitions of net zero to be confirmed later, but basically to work down on our carbon as quickly as we can. We have a trajectory which is a nice smooth line down like that towards net zero. And we've recently put a piece of legislation in to put in a milestone marker halfway between today and 2050. So 15 years from now, in 2035, we'll have had to have reduced our carbon emissions by almost 80% compared to what they were in 1990. So it's a big task. We've currently reduced them by about 41%, 42% in the intervening 30 years, since 1990. We've been very lucky. We've been able to do a lot of that through our standard grid electricity, moving more to renewables and away from coal, away from dirty fossil fuels. And that has been a relatively easy, quick win in the big scheme of things. And that has helped a lot of other businesses as well in terms of their embodied carbon, because if they're consuming electricity in the manufacture and delivery of their products and services, inherently their embodied carbon is going down as well without having to do anything more than pay their electricity bill. We're now getting to a point where it's getting a bit tougher. A lot of those things are happening already or have happened and they're in progress, but what can we do differently? How can we attack the hard to reach bits, which is what embodied carbon is? When we speak to many of our clients, they look at their own consumption and say, yeah, we've got a handle on that. We have a plan. We've signed up to some targets somewhere, but embodied carbon is harder. And I'll give you a couple of examples of why it's harder. We do a lot in and around the construction and built environment sector. And there's two clients we work with who've got some quite powerful statistics that put the scale on where embodied carbon comes in, the magnitude of how much carbon is embodied in the stuff that we buy, that we use, the services that we procure, and so on. So I was speaking with a housing developer yesterday, one of the UK's biggest housing builders, and 2/3 of their overall carbon footprint is in their supply chain. All the bricks, the blocks, the plasterboard, the windows, the doors that go into building new houses, it's all in that, and obviously the on-site construction as well. But 2/3 of their carbon is in their supply chain. Less than 1% is from their own operations directly, their own offices, their own facilities. The other third is in using the houses. So when you and I live in a house and turn the lights on and turn the heating on, that's where the other third of the carbon impact comes from. So that housing developer has direct control over barely 1% of their overall footprint. They've got an influence over the rest of it, but it is an influence. It's not a control. And we can probably have another webinar about how much control can be exerted through procurement and through contract management, something that we'll probably come on to here. How do you follow through those policies and strategies and targets through to contract management in a true procurement sense? But that puts the scale on the challenge that they have of engaging a myriad of suppliers and contractors on the scale of their footprint and what they can do about it to reduce carbon. And in their case, they've got science-based targets, quite considerably tough science-based targets that include their supply chain. So they've got a challenge ahead of themselves. There's another construction contractor that we know of who deal with roads, highways, commercial developments. In their case, it's 99% of their impact is in the supply chain. Everything that they do and deliver for their clients is delivered by their supply chain. So it's really the key thing that we need to be going for. It is getting a lot more traction from what we hear, on in the bulletins and in all the news and everything about embodied carbon. So we have lots of conversations regularly about, well, how do we tackle this? What are the routes to this? And there's several things here that come to my mind about working with the design community. It has to start right at the beginning. And that chimes with what you guys were just polling earlier on in terms of the client and government having that influence and say over what we do. For me, it's really getting in at that early concept design stage before we even get into putting an order in with contractors and suppliers. How can we embed, pun definitely intended, how can we embed low carbon thinking into our design right at the beginning so it follows through, through all those concept design stages that people go through before you get on site and then obviously out to operation. That's really the crunch of it for me, and getting in as early as possible, that it's just part of that mantra in terms of, value engineering and cost and delivery and safety on site. All those good things are important, but getting in early is really true. And also thinking about some of the concomitant benefits we can bring. Carbon is clearly very, very important. Climate change is the challenge of our time, but it's so inextricably linked with resource consumption, about the circular economy, waste reduction, single-use plastics in the ocean. All these things are linked at one level or another. Local air quality pollution as well from the consumption of fossil fuels. So we can be more holistic and cohesive in what we do. And embodied carbon is one vehicle to drive that message forward. And I'll finish with a rather startling statistic about the opportunity that's there for us. In the UK, there is a pipeline in the next decade for over £600 billion worth of spend on infrastructure. So roads, highways, waterworks, power networks, and so on. £600 billion sterling. What's that? Something like 700 billion euro. A huge opportunity to get the message across about low carbon solutions. Because once that money is spent and those designs are locked in and people start building, that carbon is spent as well as the money. So we have an opportunity now before we start spending that £600 billion.
Thank you very much, James, and thanks for being brave enough to try the Menti poll. There is a cracking question in the chat, which I'll ask you to respond to, especially given your last message, but I will ask the other speakers to pick it up as well. Surely the idea of not building at all needs to be considered.
Definitely. No, spot on, Brenda, spot on. I gave a training workshop to a power provider in the UK yesterday morning, and I took them through something called the carbon hierarchy. If you've ever done the waste hierarchy, reduce, reuse, recycle, incinerate, throw it away, there's a similar one for carbon. You may or may not know of it already. And essentially the first step is, if you don't have to do something, then don't do it. Don't build it if you've got something there that works already. Or you could renovate it rather than smashing it down and building again. Then yeah, definitely. Not always possible, of course. And there's actually a big discussion at the moment about how that's incentivized financially, certainly in the UK in terms of taxation and stuff, that it's tax preferable to knock down and start again than it is to take an existing structure and renovate it and refabricate it. So financially, it makes sense just to knock it down, which is just totally adverse to our way of thinking when you've got all that embodied carbon, the materials, and all the knock-on effects. So yeah.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, James. We've also got a question about retrofit and the skills for retrofit. But what we'll do is we'll carry on with the other presentations and maybe ask the speakers to pick up on that. These sessions are always quite conversational and informal, so please do feel free. Some of you are being very active in the chat already, so thank you for that. I'm going to hand over to Caroline now to introduce herself from Australia in the middle of the night. So thank you very much for joining us so late at night in your time zone. If you'd like to give us your perspective, please.
Hi, everybody. Welcome to Down Under. We've got a thunderstorm happening out behind our heads right now, so hopefully it doesn't flash too much, and I hope you're all having a wonderful day in whatever part of our little planet that you happen to be on. Thanks very much to James for a terrific introduction. I really enjoyed the poll there. It's quite a dynamic, participative thing. I'm hoping today to, I guess, sort of answer some of those questions. So hoping today to just progress the whole sustainable procurement question. Obviously, James provided a fantastic introduction into that opportunity that really is behind every one of those decisions that you've got an opportunity to make. In terms of when we talk about embodied carbon, and particularly for buildings, which is the sector that we specialise in, we're often asked, well, I just want the low embodied carbon material. But when we sort of say low embodied carbon, what are we actually asking for? And really, we need to transition away from the nebulous low embodied carbon to very specific performance requirements. And so we really want to be seeing and transitioning to a world where every purchase that we make has a performance metric measured in carbon, kilograms of CO2 per functional unit, the unit in which we will consume that information. And it sounds a very simple sort of thing to do. We work with it all the time. We have a couple of products that we license out to people and some information that really tries to do this. And the reason we do that is because of the key problems that our industries and our world currently faces at this very important time. The first problem is that the defining of the metric, when we start talking about Paris, what are the needs? We've got the RIBA in the UK and the American Institute of Architects all telling us, well, we need to be, and as James just said, 40% less embodied carbon today than we were yesterday. And then by 2025, 65 or 75% less. And so what does that mean in terms of the individual product I'm buying? Does it, like, low embodied carbon is that, but then how much is that? And then how much of that comes into the building? So we don't have information currently at hand and easily digestible, except by a very few of us who are in this field, to help you as procurement specialists to demand those things. So I'm hoping to try and give you a few little nuggets of gold here today to help you on that journey. And the second thing is that the failure of our current standards. So many of you will be familiar with environmental product declarations, and some of your sustainable procurement policies may already say, just select the product with the EPD. And I'm here to show you why that is a very dangerous pathway potentially. And then the other thing is then about us all getting behind defining that metric and putting it into all of our decisions, because enabling the industry with a metric as opposed to a specific product will eliminate barriers, reduce cost, and enable us to really drive overnight a transformation in many sectors which are really, frankly, dragging their feet in terms of responding to this particular issue. So I've prepared a couple of simple examples to try and really highlight how this can actually be progressed. And with luck, you'll leave here tonight a little better informed and hopefully greatly motivated to try and make a difference. So the first thing I really just want us to reflect on, I don't have a groovy little poll or anything like that, but the concept of benchmarking. So when we talk about the RIBA targets 40% less than the average, the benchmark average, this is what they're talking about. So the notion of benchmarking is fundamental to be able to make comparisons amongst products and to enable meaningful comparisons at different levels. So I'm a quantity surveyor in my background training, and it's akin to, we always say at any project, it's a bit like comparing apples with pears. Well, I'm here to try and help us compare apples with apples or pears with pears. So once we understand that, then we can understand that the current measurement approaches don't really help us. So first, very simple example, concrete. On the page here, we have just a little sample, a tiny little sample of the many thousands. I think the Carbon Leadership Forum in America said there's something close to about 10,000 environmental product declarations for concrete currently globally. I've got a few very important ones. So this is the kilograms of CO2 per cubic metre in the back of a truck about to leave the batching plant, 32 MPa, in Australia using ordinary Portland cement, in Australia using a 40% fly ash replacement, in America using ordinary Portland cement, in UK similar, and a very popular version of concrete in the UK with 50% cement replacement. So if we take, and then down here I have a geopolymer mix, a pure geopolymer replacement. If we take the average value of just this very small sample, then we would see an average value, a benchmark value of 391 kilograms of CO2 per cubic metre ready to come to our site. And then if we took the RIBA goals to say, well, today we need to have a 40% haircut, then that number against average would give us a number closer to 235 kilograms of CO2 per cubic metre. And if we move forward to 2025, then something hopefully closer to 176. Now remember, this is again just our little baby sample. And if we have a look at, if we were just asking for low embodied carbon concrete, then if we were in Australia, we might be lucky and get this one. And if we're in the UK, we might be lucky and get this one. But you can see none of the standard products out there in the market today give us what we need, which is actually a number that is here. So if we were actually wanting to ask for something, except I'll say the only thing that does actually make it is geopolymer. And if we look at the way the current standards of concrete are dictated to globally, they're very much around the big players in concrete. It's a very narrow field globally from an industry point of view, and geopolymers have been pushed out. There's currently now a standard being developed for geopolymers. So in a nutshell here, what we want to be actually asking for, now we understand very briefly a little bit about, well, if we want to be pushing our building towards something akin to this Paris goal, net zero, using the Royal Institute of British Architects percentages, then we want to be looking for a performance target of 176 kilograms of CO2 for our concrete delivered to site. So thinking about this in a specification way, then maybe what we should be seeing is something more like this. You're putting your specification together, your performance brief, your responsible procurement. We have a bunch of different performance attributes, how we're used to specifying concrete, a strength grade at 28 days in MPa terms, a slump capability in millimetres, an aggregate size in millimetres. So let's start adding an embodied carbon performance measure in kilograms of CO2 per cubic metre, and these figures are based on these types of blends. So a very simple, we have, as we heard, 700 billion pounds, which is an awful lot of Australian dollars, of infrastructure projects in the UK. Making even just this simple example and providing a number means that when you put that out into the market, then it takes the argument away from saying, I want wholesome, I want concrete specific ABC, which tends to, when you nominate a product, push the price up. In this way, you're just saying, here's a performance metric, and if you don't meet this performance metric, then you can't play. Overnight, you will transform the industry because all of these guys know they can't meet that number, and so therefore they will have to reform the way they do business, the way they procure things, the way they deliver and act as businesses to be able to deliver these numbers. And it will open up the market to innovation and alternative products that we, frankly, probably don't even know around the corner. So let's take another example, the humble brick. And if you're to believe all of the noise, if we just built enough buildings of brick and timber, we wouldn't have climate change. But here's the failure of the way our systems currently work. If we look at, and you could probably get a half a dozen EPDs, environmental product declarations, from a half a dozen different systems around the world. Generally speaking, the way that the environmental product declaration you pick up will communicate to you the global warming of kgs of CO2 is per kilogram of brick. So in this case, this is a brick in Australia. It's a clay brick, and for every kilogram of brick, we have something like about 0.32 of a kilogram of CO2. But then a designer is saying, I have 10,000 square metres of wall, and I just want to know how much is 1 square metre of wall. So how many kilograms of brick is in my wall? I don't know, this is too hard. I'm going to go off and do something else. And then if we just think about the individual brick itself is over 3 kilograms. So therefore 1 brick of this type of clay brick is 0.99, almost 1 kilogram of CO2 per brick. And then we look at that individual brick and we pop it into a wall, and on the basis of the size of this brick, we need 50 of them to make 1 square metre of wall. And then we need cement and sand and some labour to put it all together. And now we have, for 1 square metre of wall, over 77 kilograms of CO2 per square metre of finished one skin of this type of brick wall. So, brick, are we buying Rockstar or a rock? So then what we really want to be looking at from a design perspective, and this is where we want to be having performance metrics, is what is it in a wall and how does that wall compare to other walls of a similar sort of performance? So similarly, just like the concrete sort of story, we've got some assemblies here. All of them doing a fire, a thermal and performance for a single wall, an internal wall in a building. And if we compare all of these, here's our embodied carbon intensity per square metre finished wall on our site. And you can see here our brick. So from this humble little almost nothing, 230 grams of CO2 per kilogram, I've now got a brick wall that's actually above average when it comes to embodied carbon intensity. And that doesn't even account for the extra concrete and structure I'm going to need because it's a heavy product as compared to some of these lighter weight products. So taking the same approach of this sample, where's our average? What's our average benchmark number? 68 kilograms of CO2 per square metre of finished wall. And then we have a look at, well, we have some options over this end of the spectrum that are similar from a functional point of view and less embodied carbon. And if we look at this 40% reduction, then we're sort of, we're transforming exactly how these building materials work into a system down at this particular end. And in our country, we have a thing called speed panel, which I know we were alluding to cost, is actually transforming the commercial building industry here because it's very fast, it's very cheap, and it is performing all these different criteria. And from an embodied carbon point of view, all the builders we work with here, it's a win-win because it's almost got no embodied carbon. And when we think that a commercial office building and certainly an apartment building, between 5 and 8% of the entire building is carbon is in the internal walls, then the ability of actually selecting something down here as opposed to something up here, all of a sudden you could shave 2.5 or 3% of carbon off the whole building with just that one selection and save yourself money and time simultaneously, which to me is sustainability. So I think that the summing up of all of my discussion here, and these are just two little examples, and then we have to look at the whole building itself and understand, Reba and Letty and the AIA, a few of them have come out with figures that say, here's how much embodied carbon is in a square metre of a building. We are doing a set of standards down here in Australia, and we've looked at all of these numbers, and many of those numbers don't include the whole building, just part of the building. The measurements are different. So there's a lot of complexity. And so our goal is us and that, for those of us who are trying to help you as procurers is to try and dumb down the noise and to be able to get some really clear information so that you as the consumer can actually be asking for these things. Same sort of thing. In this sense, I want internal walls and I need them to have less carbon than this amount. And that leaves it open to all sorts of different alternatives. Having said all of that, if we then had a look at, well, what might be some of the recycled content versions or options for some of these things, we have variants of steel framing here in this country that would bring it from, if we utilise them, from 86 sort of more down to here. As I said before, if you were using a non-cement based mortar and potentially a brick that was carbon neutral brick or something, you would transform this number to be down in this zone and a bunch of different options in between. So that's why it's really important that we move our lives towards these performance metrics in a functional unit that is in the form of the consumption and how we think about the design and use of the materials. Of having time with you this evening, I would say to you that there's just an urgent need for all of you who are in this area of sustainable procurement to learn how to ask for that product with a quantitative performance metric, not low embodied carbon or it's just got an EPD. We want to be able to also then essentially reform the basket of standards that we have, recognise that they're not really serving this purpose to advance our reductions in a scientific and evidence and quantitative comparable way, and reform those standards so that we do start making traction in that area. The Royal Institute of Chartered Surveyors put out a terrific guide about how to measure whole building embodied carbon. There's a bunch of things that they included that were a great start, and then a whole bunch of other things that then a number of us here in Australia are working towards in terms of filling in some key gaps on how do you normalise the functional area, some technical standards and methods around all the different types of regional issues, inventory issues, and a few other technical things that take a whole webinar that's not sort of just 10 minutes, and to try and improve these things so that you, as very forefront of making these actions, have the ability to start asking for it in a metric that, as I said before, will transform the industry overnight. I did actually notice a question in the chat box there. What's the capacity of our industry to do this? On the basis of the current standards, our capacity to transform this industry is very limited. But if we were to actually sort of open it up and actually say, you know what, we can leverage quantity surveying, we can leverage all of those people who currently understand how to measure operating carbon, we leverage the way building measurement systems work, then we open ourselves up to an enormous energy and enormous resources to really transform things in a way that's consistent with the timeframes that we have in front of us. So I'm hoping that that helps in some minor way of helping you to understand the opportunity that's in front of you, and do hope that has been helpful and potentially have some great discussion as well. Thank you so much.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Carolina. I think for me, there's a couple of very significant takeaways from there. As an old procurement professional, I've always said what you specify is what you get, and how you specify things is so important. And also the power of procurement to make changes. If we start to ask for these things in the right way and measure what the supply chain is doing, we can move markets. And personally, I've experience of doing this on the London Olympics, where we've specified products to the world market that didn't exist. We specified them early enough to say, if you want to supply to the London Olympics and get all of the publicity and the kudos of supplying to the Olympics in London, then develop a new product, and people do. So that's really fantastic. Thank you. There's lots and lots of comment in the chat from Nepal. I will ask the speakers just to take a look at that as we go through, and then respond to it when we get to the Q&A at the end. But Louis, if I can hand over to you to follow that, please.
My name is Louis Brimacombe, and my title here is, I thought I'd push the boat out a bit and talk about beyond embodied carbon. And in some respects, Caroline was talking about that. My background, I've had 30 years of doing LCA work and various other things, but I was head of environmental technology for Tata Steel for 20 years. And then more recently, I'm chairman of something called the IOM3 Sustainable Development Group. That's Institute of Materials to you guys. And also, I'm the chairman of one of the British Standards Committees, SCP1 on Sustainable Performance, Consumption and Production. And today, that's a picture of my garden, by the way, which is a lot of work, but it's absorbing a lot of carbon. So I'm going for net zero. That's a joke. So I'm going to be talking a little bit about life cycle thinking, life cycle assessment, which kind of sets the background for embodied carbon, if you like, but also a little bit about circular economy. And sometimes circular economy and life cycle assessment or low carbon don't necessarily match up very well. And that can be a concern if your main focus just on one or the other, particularly. But my main challenge in my life at the moment is, how do you actually acquire sustainability? How do you get to being sustainable? And what does that actually mean? And it can include aspects of life cycle thinking. But sustainability to me, in a very general sense, is about how to make things better and not worse. And having done life cycle assessments over the years, invariably you can make something better in one respect, but worse in another. And the question is, who have you made it better for and in what respect? So it's, and very often sustainability is about trade-offs, and the evaluation methods of sustainability should help you to understand those trade-offs and make a decision, an informed decision about what you think is a good thing to do overall. So we're all familiar with these, I think, the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, but the important thing about this was it actually did raise awareness that sustainability is not just about low carbon, which is number 13 in the bottom left-hand corner, but it's about making society a better place. And there's various attributes to that on this slide. And I think that is truly, and overall, you're not going to make the world a better place if you keep emitting carbon and make the world unlivable in, or hard to live in, or difficult to live in, or if you ruin certain nations' ability to grow food or whatever. So it's a huge point, number 13. But at the same time, we do need infrastructure. We do need to improve the quality of life of developing nations and so on. And indeed, we need to continue to improve education and all that sort of thing in all of the developed nations as well. So sustainability is a high level goal. This is one way of framing it, if you like. So life cycle assessment is something I've been dealing with for a long time, and I'm very philosophical about it now. I don't actually do LCAs now. I just do critical reviews and so on. And this is a typical LCA of things I've worked with in the past. So it could be a car, it could be a building, it could be a structure. The trend used to be, and still is to some extent, so embodied energy is these parts. It's about the materials that go into it, and the operational carbon is kind of the use phase. So embodied carbon of building, I'm sure most of you know this, is about the bricks, mortar, the supply chain, the mining, all that stuff, and the build. But then when you start turning the electricity on and so on, the operational carbon of the building is different. One slightly controversial thing is the bottom right, where for years and years there's been a big battle about should you include end of life recycling in the embodied carbon calculations. And at the moment, I think the feeling is yes, particularly since plastics, if you ignore the end of life of plastics, you can end up with a big problem that you've not addressed. So that kind of pushed it that way a little bit. But what's important about this? So I've said that operational carbon tended to be the priority. So the policymakers, the politicians all said, look, we've got to make cars more efficient. We've got to make buildings more efficient, because we've looked at the LCAs and that's where 60% of the emissions are. That's where, concentrate on that. So over the years, what has happened is that we've reduced that with an attempt to get the operational carbon down, and this graph here shows it's 0. But by doing that, you may have added material impacts, embodied energy, which I know is one of the concerns of this meeting here. So you might have triple glazing on buildings, you might be building solar panels, you might be building new wind farms and putting them next to it. So you might have low carbon technologies, but more materials to achieve that. And another interesting aspect of it is that end of life side, is that some of the materials that we're using now to create low carbon in our society are less recyclable, or perhaps the recycling has not been considered very well. So electric vehicles, the batteries, it's pretty energy intensive to make a battery, and it's very difficult with the current battery designs to recycle them. At the moment, that's not really talked about very much. But one of the kind of things you could think about here is that, are you converting from solving a problem of carbon and climate change, but actually ending up with a materials resource efficiency problem? In other words, shifting from a climate change problem maybe to a circular economy problem. And so I'll talk a little bit about circular economy, which is, and it's also about, on this slide, assume that this was about carbon and embodied carbon. But one of the things that Caroline touched upon is what is the carbon doing that you've embodied? And so this is a slide about circular economy that I use to try and illustrate what is good circular economy practice. And really, some people think about it as being recycling, and that's at the bottom end. So there's an arrow in the middle here. I don't know if you can see my slide, but the bottom end here is recycling. But the highest attribute you can have for circular economy is creating a product that lasts a very long time and continues to work well in terms of creating social value. So in other words, it works, it's efficacious, it's got efficacy, and it's efficient, and it lasts a long time. So that kind of, if you reflect on some of the thinking we've got today about embodied carbon, if you had an embodied carbon calculation for a building that lasted 10 years, How does that compare with something that might have twice the embodied carbon, but lasted 100 years? So, and then you start thinking about the whole life cycle of buildings and structures and all the stuff that, so in many respects, and you can go down into things like reuse, life extension, maintenance systems, all those things, which effectively do increase the life of these products going forward. But one of the big things that happens is eventually the social value can deteriorate in the product. In other words, we don't think it's useful anymore, either as individuals or as groups or as investors maybe. And so it's something to think about in terms of circular economy. The other thing to think about is, in my life of dealing with LCA, I increasingly started to think about what used to be called triple bottom line thinking, and today I'm calling it 3-pillar life cycle thinking. So I knew that we had in the environment circle at the bottom, we have LCA that helps you to understand the life cycle impacts of, and I agree with Caroline, there's a lot of variations in methodology and it can be a bit confusing, and EPDs may be imperfect in what they do, but the methodology ultimately is aimed at trying to get you to understand impacts across the supply chain and across the life cycle, including use and end of life. And that's a good thing, I think, so that's good. But you need to be careful about interpreting results, for example. In the economics side of it, you've got obviously things like life cycle costing. So there are some ways of life cycle thinking. It doesn't necessarily influence developers to think life cycle, because they're paying for the upfront building, not necessarily for the operation of the building. So they might go for something cheap and cheerful and not very energy efficient. Another aspect in terms of economics is whether something is affordable. So you might have a low carbon technology, but it might not be affordable. Electric cars, for example, they're pretty expensive at the moment. And the viability thing is, can businesses actually continue to survive? You can't, if you can't make money out of a system. So that has a lot to do with business models and how they would work. On the bottom right-hand side, social is always mentioned in this 3-pillar thinking, if you like. But I continuously thought about what's about social value in a life cycle context. You know, how does that work? And the more you think about it, the more important it becomes. And one of the ideas that's being bandied around at the moment is, can you create a sustainability footprint where you engage all these things in a life cycle context? But let me just show you one of the slides. So I should promote some of the standards that already exist in this area. So there's an old one in 2012, BS 8905, which tried to address the 3-pillar life cycle thinking on sustainable use of materials. It's a big leap in thinking, so it hasn't yet been adopted. I think it's probably before its time. But more recently, there's been a really good standard on social value. In other words, trying to set out what we mean by social value in terms of the well-being of society, the well-being of individuals, and so on. But what's not been addressed really, and it has a strong relationship with sustainable procurement and the ISO standard thereof, along with many other things, and that is thinking about social value across the life cycle. I do this lecture at universities, and this bit takes about 15 minutes on its own, but the point of it is, let's say this is a model about where you look at the performance of a product, you look at the provenance, where does it come from, and you look at the legacy. In other words, what are all the long-term hits, including the LCA hits, the carbon footprint, for example, might be the legacy value. But the first thing, and I think Caroline touched upon it a little bit here, is that you want products to do a certain thing, and you want them to work well and provide social value. And there'll be various attributes that do that. And this is, in this slide here, I've put things like space, comfort, noise. Safety is a massive one. Would you want a lower carbon product, which was a little bit less safe? That is just surely not acceptable. And in fact, so this slide here, the things above the line are good things. They're joyful things. They make society a better place. And the things below the line are bad things. They make society a less appealing place. And you can see that I've put an unsafe product really is very negative, and Grenfell Tower's cladding system could be regarded as that. They might have tried to improve the aesthetics of the building by making it look a nicer building than it was, the retrofit, if you like. But in doing so, put a material on that was not fire safe, and really that is not sustainable. So what I'm saying is, it's all right working out low carbon, but you've got to think about the product performance and what it delivers. You also need to think about, if I want more product performance, more social value, for example, let's say you're talking about mobile phones and you had, let's say the average battery life was 6 hours and a product came on the market that was 15 hours, very attractive, much more convenient, higher levels of social value from that. But there's a price to pay for that extra social value, in that you might require more lithium. So then you go to the provenance side. What's happening in terms of the materials that go into that product? More lithium, more mining of critical metals and so on. Would it involve labor? What kind of labor are you talking about? All the things that come in sustainable procurement concepts and so on. So people are asking for more social value, but have they considered the provenance? Have they considered the impacts upstream of that? And even the health and safety of workers in those factories or the mines and the artisan mines and so on. So this is how I'm trying to get you to think about, I want to add social value, but I'm very mindful of the impacts that would have. And then on the right-hand side, you might say, well, look, how long, what's the legacy of this product? How long will it last? How long will it keep its social value, for example? Could you reuse it? So you might have a phone that has a longer battery life, and you realize that might have bigger impacts in the upstream. But you might say, well, look, but if you can recycle it, if you can take all the components out and save the lithium, save all the copper aspects and all that stuff, maybe that does lower the legacy of this. So it's about, and here I'm talking about more about social value than embodied carbon, but embodied carbon does come into it because in some respects, carbon emissions have a social impact. They affect our lives. Another example I've seen in the chat, there's been talk about earthquakes and so on. In Tokyo, I used to go to Tokyo quite a bit, and in downtown Tokyo, some of the buildings there are built within probably very high embodied energy, but they have these incredible structures with concrete and steel-based structures, but they're earthquake-proof. And I remember somebody once commented that when the building begins to shake, I have less concern for the carbon footprint, because the important thing is the building stays up and protects people within it and around. And that's the kind of thinking I think that I'm thinking. So I'm an advocate really of thinking about sustainability footprinting, which would include carbon footprinting. On here, I've pointed out to you that responsible sourcing schemes, which again, I guess has got a strong link with sustainable procurement, they will help with this provenance side. In other words, if you keep on asking questions about your upstream suppliers, they will be incentivized to improve as time goes on. On the bottom end, you might have deal breakers. You might have a rule in your company or a rule in your own individual parameters that says, if it's plastic and it gets in the oceans, it's not acceptable to me. That could be a decision. So it could be a deal breaker. That's my point. And yet you would have to look at, if it was a plastic packaging system, you'd look at what's the kind of social value of that. It's lightweight, it protects food and so on. So you've got to balance that out. If you take that packaging system away, will you end up with more food waste or less durable food products and so on? So, and you've always got to have that balance, but this approach will help you be informed about that. So just to summarize what I think my philosophy is, that if you're designing things for sustainability, you've got to think about the social value of the products that you're making and how long the social value is provided for. In other words, how long that thing lasts for. I think if you're talking about construction and embodied carbon, you do have to think about the function of the building, the legacy of the building, how long will it last, and so on. Of course, the big challenge is that we can add social value, but it tends to make things more expensive. And also sometimes it makes things not so profitable for companies because they're having to add things on that's not necessarily a margin for them. And I think this is one of the design sustainability. We need to incentivize affordability for sustainable buildings, incentivize that through whatever means. And that's something that COP26 could think about. Anyway, so that is my last slide. Thank you for listening.
Thank you very much, Louis. Some great food for thought there, and certainly very relevant to those people in the procurement profession in the room, understanding how we can actually influence through procurement and how we make these choices through the life and the legacy of a product, if you like. So Josh from the USA, who's very early in the morning there. So Josh, can I hand over to you to kind of sum up and share your thoughts on what you've heard so far?
Yeah, Shaun, thank you very much. It was very early when we started. We've been going for an hour now. So now it's just, early. So I have no slides, folks. We've been talking at you for a while now. I want to get to the good stuff, which is the five of us talking with each other. But a couple of thoughts, especially from what everyone's already talked about. Number one to me is the talk around what net zero means, right? Louis made mention, Caroline's made mention. I joked about it with James at the top. We need definition around what net zero means. There are lots of organizations around the world saying we're going to be net zero by blank. Typically what they mean is operational. Louis defined that earlier, right? That operational, that use phase carbon. We should all understand, procurement-wise, just in regular everyday life, carbon is everywhere. We've done a really good job on the use phase. We've changed out our light bulbs. Our grid is getting easier to work with, right? We're getting more and more renewable on that. So that use phase is getting much less. We need to define net zero or push people to define net zero in a larger sense to include embodied carbon. The second point there is they're making these claims, and apologies, I took notes, so I'm going to look down every once in a while. I'm interested in everyone. I actually took notes, Shaun. I know that's shocking. Net zero claims.
Never.
Haven't actually, net zero claims that are being made sometimes aren't actually measuring to begin with. So people are making net zero claims. Hey, we're going to be net zero by 2030. And we're making that claim because our competitor made a claim and we're just going to make a claim. And I'm dealing with sustainable professionals at companies on every continent except Antarctica who are saying, yeah, our C-suite just made a decision and I have no idea, because you can't get to zero if you don't know where the heck you are. So I'm sorry, if great, you know how to get to your end destination, or you know where your end destination is, but if you don't know where you're starting, you don't know what roads to take. So that's incredibly important as well. As I mentioned, the grid work, James talked about it early on. Our grids are getting greener. And that's a good thing. We hope they're getting greener because we hope that a lot of our renewable energy production, right, is actually that embodied carbon is not as high. We're hopefully doing a lot of work on our windmills and PV and geothermal to understand that the embodied carbon there is not too much, that the use phase carbon is being saved. Grid work's easy. As James said, a lot of the embodied carbon is coming down quickly because, factories are okay, great. I'm just using the windmill factory or the windmill farm that has been put up off the coast of the UK, or that has just been approved here in the US. President Biden's administration here in the US just yesterday approved our very first offshore wind farm. Congratulations to us. We're only 20 years behind the rest of the world. The problem is supply chains are hard. Anyone in procurement can tell you that after years and years of being in procurement. Correct. After a couple of days, someone could tell you supply chains are hard. We can barely understand if there's slave labor or child labor in our supply chains. Now we're asking to understand carbon. So let's take the grid wins, but let's start to push for more understanding through the supply chain. And what I mean by that is, okay, you're the purchaser, ask your tier one suppliers for their data, for their information, whether it be through Caroline expanding concepts around EPDs and that data, whether you're asking for scope 1, 2 data emissions around greenhouse gas, whatever you're asking for, like Shaun said, and Caroline mentioned, set your standard, ask them to meet it. That's great. but then they have to take the step to push their tier 1 supplier, because then that's, you know, getting to their tier 2 and moving down. That's getting to your tier 2 and moving down. The other thing that I hear a lot of discussions about is you may hear terms scope 1, scope 2, scope 3, greenhouse gas emissions. There's lots of different conversations around what those entail. It literally, as Caroline mentioned, there's entire hour-long presentations that I can give around what those specifically are. But the concern now is scope 3. It's that supply chain world, right? Scope 3, just so you understand, is that hidden carbon way over here from my supply chain, what it's coming from. The one thing to note about scope 3 is it's someone else's scope 1 and 2. So if we start to push scope 1 and 2, as many people as possible doing their own scope 1 and 2, which is much easier. Not saying it's easy, please note. I'm in no way, shape, or form am I saying measuring and understanding your own scope 1 and 2 is easy. But if everyone starts to look at their own scope 1 and 2, that's someone else's scope 3. So you can start to push that understanding deeper and deeper if you just understand your own house. I use that colloquially. Finally, I did find it interesting, James, and I'll bring it completely back to the beginning, Shaun, and hopefully this will kick off some conversation. That client and government were number 1 in the Menti poll in terms of, you know, who's driving this conversation. I'm gonna flip it on you a little bit. My answer was investors, and I think I was one of only 1 or 2 who actually made that answer. And here's the reason. The reason your clients are asking for this is because their money is now asking for this, right? I'm not saying that there aren't, you know, wonderful human beings who all want to save the planet. I would think most of the people on this call, and I know all the experts on the call, are trying to make the world a better place and hopefully limit the climate crisis that we're in. But the thing that has changed the conversation most, I used to deal with architects, designers, specifiers, purchasers, government officials, building owners, operators, manufacturers. I used to deal with all those people. That was my full-time job, just dealing with them to understand what's going on in sustainability and help them move the ball a little bit forward. You know who I've been talking to for the last year? Investor relations teams and investment firms. Because now BlackRock is telling everyone they need to understand your carbon. BlackRock is the largest single investor on the planet with trillions of dollars in investment. Pounds, euros, Icelandic money, US money, dollars. I mean, they've got trillions and trillions of dollars to invest, and people want that. And they've started literally voting against boards that don't talk about climate change and carbon. So while I appreciate the answers here and everyone's view is different, the reason your clients are asking is because their investors are pushing them to ask now, in my opinion. That's a huge percentage of why it's happening. So if we don't start talking about carbon in terms of financial world, we're going to be left behind in this conversation and letting the financial world drive a conversation that we helped initiate. So we need to start being able to have those conversations in investor relations. Start making friends with your investor relations team and your C-suite and your CFO and your organization, because educate them, because they're going to start to be asked. And now you're the internal hero and can start to be part of that conversation. So Shaun, that's my wrap up. So hopefully we get to the good stuff now and start asking each other some fun questions.
Okay, thank you very much, Josh. Yeah, I would certainly endorse what you're saying about investors. A lot of the clients that we work with now, maybe some of the more thoughtful clients around sustainable procurement, are seeing pressure from investors, and it's starting to become a very, very key issue. And indeed, it is the reason why a lot of clients are asking for this with their supply chains, as most organizations around the world are waking up to the idea that a significant percentage of what they do is done through the supply chain. So yeah, thank you very much for that. All of this, we've had some fascinating presentations this morning and only 20 minutes left to have a bit of a discussion, but hopefully that'll be a useful 20 minutes. I think this is building a case for the power of procurement to change things, which is why we're here. It's why we do what we do in ISO2400.org. I think as procurement professionals, we don't necessarily need to fully understand the detail of some of the issues that you've heard from Caroline and Louis, but we do need to know where to get help, and we do need to know how to specify things properly so we end up with the outcomes that we actually desire in the first place. So if I can just throw open a couple of questions, and maybe if I can go back to the beginning, and James, you mentioned science-based targets.
Mm-hmm.
What is a science-based target, and what does it mean, in your opinion? I can see lots of people
hour long.
grinning. Yeah, yeah, I know. Sorry about that. It was a bit of a hospital pass.
What we should do, actually, in seriousness, is put up the link to the sustainability short we've got on the supply chain school. We can do that later. But in short, science-based targets. So in Paris, we agreed that we wanted to keep global warming to no more than 2 degrees, and ideally well below 2, and even better, keep it down to 1.5 degrees above pre-industrial levels. That's for the global average. And there's a lot of science and very clever people who have worked out a carbon budget, effectively, how much carbon we as a planet can emit to stay within that 1.5 degrees warming. So if we emit more, we'll get a warmer planet. And we've got various scenarios that go 2, 3, 4 degrees and so on. But if we want to stay at 1.5 degrees additional warming above what we had before Industrial Revolution, there's a certain amount of carbon that we are allowed to emit. And there's lots of science and projections and modeling around that. So that's the budget that I've just mentioned. When you break that down in terms of what each individual organization or country or local authority or government can emit, they will get a section, they'll get a slice of that budget pie. And that is a science-based target. Essentially what they work out for you is, of the bigger amount that we can still emit so we don't cause runaway climate change, you can emit so much. That's your budget. Most organizations are emitting far more than that now, so they'll have to work their way down to that budget. So that's different to net zero. We need to be clear here. Net zero is what Josh was talking about. You can carry on to net zero if you want, but science-based targets is about bringing it down so that your contribution to the continuing emissions of carbon are within that overall global budget, so that we don't kill the planet, basically. That's it in a nutshell.
Yeah, and Shaun, this is Josh, if I may.
Yeah,
the
please
Science-Based Target Initiative. Yeah, Science-Based Target Initiative is a great organization to understand a little bit more there. I think they've got over 1,000 individual corporations around the world now that are officially signed up through sbti.org and I have no affiliation with them. Again, I'm with UL, but they've done great work in terms of helping define carbon, how much of an offset can be purchased here or there, James, right? In terms of offsetting your carbon and what's really true zero and what's not true zero. But they've helped these organizations. And like I said, I think they've got about 1,000 different organizations right now that have officially defined their SBT or science-based target through the initiative, which is, again, a good way of it's part of that Carbon Disclosure Project, global reporting initiative, being transparent about what you're doing and actually being held to it.
And what's good about the science-based targets is that it's available to any organization. We as Action Sustainability have just submitted our own science-based target as well as an SME, a small, medium-sized enterprise. More and more are getting on board. But what's key about it is it explicitly looks at supply chain. It says if your organization's overall footprint, if 40% or more of your organizational footprint is attributable to your supply chain, then you need to include your supply chain in your science-based target. And that basically accounts for the vast majority of organizations on the planet. They will have some supply chain influence and impact. 40% is a relatively low number as we know in procurement world, the amount of stuff that we buy and procure and services and so on. So a lot of organizations go over that 40% threshold quite easily. That plays straight into the hands of supply chain management and procurement.
Okay, thanks very much, both of you. While James, you were talking, I found the Science-Based Target Sustainability short, so I put a link up to it. That's a link through to the Supply Chain School in the UK. You would have to register as a member of the school to join, but it doesn't cost you anything. So do take a look. And I think, Josh, you put a link up to the Science-Based Target, so thank you for that. So if I can maybe ask Caroline and Louis to come in, specifically on some of the comments that we've got from the Paul on, very traditional building methods and talking about building buildings from mud. In the UK, if you go into the English countryside, you'll see cob and thatch cottages that have been there for about 400 years. The building's made of mud and the roof is made of straw. And it's still standing and it still works. And there are relationships there between the kind of thermal efficiency of more traditional buildings and also, as we've already touched on, issues around earthquakes. So, Louis, would you like to pick up on that one and just expand on what you were saying earlier?
I think if the buildings provide the social value needed for the occupants, i.e. safety, warmth, comfort, and functionality in terms of what the family want to do with the building, that seems, it's perfectly reasonable to do that. I guess you would probably question that in social value terms, in modern society, you might say, well, actually, I'd like some windows because it's not very light and the lighting in the houses. And then you start to iterate towards modern buildings because they have, high social value. So there is a little bit of a balance there. If a community finds it acceptable and even desirable to live in, shall we say, more naturally based product buildings, that's great. I can imagine that many people in the developed nations will say, well, I'm not living in a hut made of hay because I want more light, I want, So that's the kind of thing. The other thing you have to think about is that if you flipped from making mass housing out of mud and huts and straw and so on, would that work? Actually, there's a good point here I'd like to make, Shaun, and that is, you talked a little bit about the Caribbean. When the Caribbean has a hurricane, it tends to destroy all the buildings on the islands. And, the insurance companies get a big flap about it. It's the same with flooding in the UK. The insurance companies will replace like with like. If you get your kitchen flooded in the UK, the insurance company will replace it with the same kitchen. And then when it's flooded again, it's the same story. So the question is, if you want to build resilience to hurricanes and to flooding and so on, you're probably going to need stronger buildings. In other words, we're going to have to invest more in protecting that. And I think, it's a strong social value to have these safer structures, hopefully hurricane surviving structures, but they might involve more embodied carbon today. But because you avoid rebuilding them every 5 years, every time you have a hurricane, overall, the embodied carbon's worth it. So there's a few of my thoughts about what's acceptable in terms of living standards, what's acceptable in terms of, safety in society and reusability, if you like.
Brilliant. Thank you very much for that. We've got a question for Roland Clark that I'm not sure I can answer, saying that you've done some fantastic work in the Caribbean, authoring a procurement manual, but it's only gone so far. So the question is, where can you obtain funding for the next piece of work? I'm not absolutely sure I can answer that, but if you do want to contact us by email, and then maybe we can help to distribute that around and see if we can get some support for that piece of work. So thank you for that. I think if I can take us back again to a question that was asked earlier in the chat, as we seem to be focusing a little bit on buildings, and that's the issue of retrofit. And certainly in developed countries around the world, 90% of the buildings that are going to be there in 50 years' time are already there. So it's lovely to talk about, embodied carbon in new build. But what are and I think, Louis, you've already touched on, for instance, the embodied carbon in an electric vehicle and the recyclability of the products, etc. As we start to move towards retrofitting buildings, what are the issues there? And Caroline, if I can maybe ask you to lead off on that one, and then we'll see what the rest of the panel think.
Yeah, thanks, Shaun. It's a great question, because obviously by some figures, we have to double the amount of buildings on the planet that currently exists today by 2060 or something. And there's some lovely little throwaway number that's saying that means we have to build a new New York City equivalent each 40 days for the next 30, 40 years to 2060. So then what is in that already built sequestered embodied carbon, how can we ensure that as that goes through, it doesn't contribute or exacerbate the problem? If we have a look at the embodied carbon of a whole footprint, of a whole building, I don't know, let's take an office building, for example, about half of that, excluding the tenants, right? So the tenants themselves, when you think about the tenant fit out, the furniture and all the rest of it, that would add another potentially third to the whole building, embodied carbon. So if you take the tenants out and then you just look at that base building, about 50% of that building will be renewed completely over a 25 to 30 year, 35 year, depending on what sort of ownership you've got. And that's through air conditioning replacements, bathroom replacements, lift replacements, lobby replacements, etc. We've been working with one of our bigger property trusts here in Australia who have done a science-based target. We helped them do the modelling for that, and they set themselves a 50% embodied carbon reduction for all their capital works projects. So basically that's all their replacement works within their office portfolio, which is about 40 odd buildings here in Australia. And what was really interesting was that they sort of thought, oh my God, this is going to be really, really super hard. But in actual fact, we, over 10 projects last year, worked with them to get an average 42% reduction as compared to their standard quality performance guidelines. And we've basically done an assessment of those. So here's the embodied carbon, here's how you can reduce that down, and work with every one of their designers and all their managers who procure these renewals. And it surprised me actually, because some of the projects had significant reduction, because otherwise the mandate was chuck it out and get new ones, because that's just easy. And in actual fact, we proved that in actual fact it was better if you actually didn't do that. And a whole bunch of different material procurement options, once you understood that embodied carbon performance number in per square metres or in absolute terms for each of those individual projects, the progress that can be made. So I would come back to what I was sort of saying in my talk, which is taking the question of embodied carbon as a performance metric, and be very clear when we do this with these companies. We're not saying you trade off quality, you're trading off safety, you're trading off all these other things just because embodied carbon is the most important thing. Embodied carbon becomes one of their metrics that sits beside safety, serviceability, cost, durability, a half a dozen other standards that they have to meet just from building quality, building performance here in Australia. So they're not compromising on any of those things. They're just adding the carbon to it and still delivering on all those other outcomes. And in particular, financial, like you talk about BlackRock demanding these things. These guys are very large investors, and through this sort of process, they've attracted capital from bodies as bonds and debt at preferential interest rate, because they're committing to these things, and they're able to take the reports that we give them and say, well, here's the evidence, because there's actual metrics here about how much better we are from an embodied carbon point of view. And when we add up those projects over a year, the amount of carbon today avoided is equal to whole buildings' operating carbon footprint for multiple years. So, and I'm an advocate of the time cost of money. And so a kilo of carbon we save today is worth multiple times more than a kilo of carbon that we are saying, okay, well, we'll put in extra chilled beams and we'll put in operable windows, and hopefully over the next 10 years that gets paid back somewhere down the line. But who knows? There's apparently some fantastic report about to come out from the US government saying they've had a look at all the Energy Star buildings that the US government's procured, and none of them are saving any more energy than they were before they did the process of Energy Star. So what does that tell you about the risk that we face of just sort of going, okay, well, let's put all our eggs in the basket of operating carbon? So come back to, we need metrics that sit hand in glove with other performance requirements. It just becomes part and parcel of our procurement, so long as we understand what that benchmark is and what that number has to be in order to be able to push the ticker the right way.
Okay, thank you.
Shaun,
I was going to say we're nearly out of time, but I need to give the final word to Josh. Over to you.
Oh, no. So, sorry. So no, Caroline, the one thing to note here though is, and it's an awful way to put it, so my apologies, but COVID has actually given us an opportunity for these retrofit concepts to solve a couple of our problems, carbon sustainability problems. But yes, also, I know many developed nations and developing nations have a housing crisis going on right now where we don't have enough housing, but we have so much commercial space that is not being utilized at the moment due to COVID. So what is standing in some of our ways in the developed nations specifically is things like codes and laws. So if we can get people to stop thinking just about an ordinance that this has to be a commercial building, why can't it be a multi-use building, right? And start to put the people in the building, right, Caroline?
Yeah, 100%. I mean, but you look at the global problem we've got is that every nation in this planet is building its way out of COVID. So if you look at China's production of steel is up 17% to record highs. And if you have a look at Windy, which has got, CO2 emissions as an active live on-demand layer, we're accelerating our problem here right now. So every day that people are procuring stuff without having some sort of target as a starting point is a day lost to a much bigger problem. Change, organisational change is a 5-year gig. So you might want to go, oh yeah, we're going to set a net zero target today, and next year, yeah, okay, it takes us a year to do it. Next year we'll measure it, and then you measure it and you think, oh my God, it's gone up the wrong way. Better make everybody responsible for it, and that's another year. So already now you're another 4 years down the track before anything happens. So I just urge everybody who's got a decision to make about purchasing something, get a target, get a number, halve it as a starting point, and then go from there.
Brilliant.
And
thank you
share
very
the
much,
building.
Scott. Get a number and halve it. Yes, we've seen examples in the UK with Anglian Water, which I don't have time to talk about in detail, but they did that several years ago. They not only achieved their target, but they saved tens of millions of pounds as a result of doing it. So we really are out of time. I love these things because we could all talk for about a fortnight on these subjects, but unfortunately we are out of time. Thank you very much to all of our speakers for a really compelling discussion. Key messages: procurement really does play a part. Have a baseline, have some targets, really understand what you're specifying, and I guess be confident in asking your supply chain to improve, because there is a demand from this. It's coming from investors, it's coming from clients, it's coming from government. So getting your supply chain fit to supply is a really, really important issue. So thank you very much. Enjoy the rest of your day, evening, morning, wherever you are in the world. Do join our next session with us. Do go to our website for more information, and enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you very much indeed.